Welcome back to Outlaw Operations, where every story draws you further into the quiet corners of the human soul, the places where shadows speak louder than light. Tonight's journey is one of love tainted by ambition, and a dream slowly unraveling into a web of deceit, betrayal, and heartbreak. Before we begin, I'd like to offer my heartfelt gratitude to each one of you, our incredible subscribers and loyal viewers. Your continued presence here means more than words can express. And if you happen to be among the 94% who join us without subscribing, I extend a gentle invitation. Why remain a visitor when you can become part of the story? Click that subscribe button, and walk with us through these haunting tales. Your support not only fuels this channel, it becomes a part of the narrative we're building together. Now, make yourself comfortable. Tonight's story is one you won't soon forget. Sarah once believed that her marriage to Jason could weather anything. But by the time her eyes lost their light and her voice trembled in every conversation, it was clear something inside her had withered. Exhausted beyond words, she told those close to her that she couldn't carry the weight of the marriage anymore. It was breaking her from the inside out. She quietly packed up her life and moved into a modest house provided by her church, a place meant for refuge, though the shadows followed her even there. The divorce process had only just begun, and it was shaping up to be a long, bitter war. Jason's business affairs made the division of assets complicated. There was child custody to consider too, for kids whose lives would now be split in two. Still, Sarah stayed grounded, drawing strength from her church, which wrapped her in some semblance of warmth during the coldest period of her life. But not everything could be soothed. Sarah's anxiety began to swell in ways even her prayers couldn't calm. The weight of being a mother, the stress of the court, and Jason's constant criticism, it all chipped away at her peace. He accused her of frivolous spending, said she was obsessed with shopping, a drain on his wealth. After the separation, things only got worse. Her finances crumbled, her sleep abandoned her, and depression crept in like a fog that refused to lift. When she finally decided to leave the home she and Jason once shared, she reached out to her friends Dana and Lawrence. They came to help her move, but what they saw haunted them. Sarah was frantic, her hands trembling as she threw belongings into bags, her voice quivering every time the wind rustled through the trees. She kept forgetting items, rushing in and out of the house in a frenzy. Her eyes darted toward the road more times than anyone could count. It was clear she feared he might come back, and then, he did. Jason's car pulled up as they were loading the last few things. Lawrence stepped between them and asked him not to enter. Jason paused, watched, then slowly backed away. But even after his car disappeared down the road, Sarah couldn't stop shaking. She wept, clinging to the doorframe like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She confessed that Jason had threatened her before, told her she would regret ever asking for help. 2 long years crawled by before the divorce was finalized. They agreed to shared custody. At the time, their twins were 12 and 7. The court ordered Jason to pay $3,000 in monthly support, half his income, but Sarah received no share of his assets. She remained in the church-owned house. Jason moved out too, but not far. Just a few blocks away, in a house he shared with his aging mother, always close enough to watch. Then came November 27, 2017. It was the Monday after Thanksgiving. Sarah didn't show up for work. Her classroom remained dark, her phone silent. Her co-workers grew concerned. This wasn't like her. One of them drove to her home around 8:30 a.m., expecting maybe illness, perhaps a car breakdown. Instead, they found her outside the house. Still. Cold. Lifeless. Sarah had been shot, multiple times. A close-range shotgun blast had torn through her chest and head. Her body had collapsed near the driveway, steps from her car. She had left the house early, just after 6:30 a.m., likely heading to school. But someone was waiting. Neighbors said they heard gunshots that morning. But this was a rural stretch where loud bangs were common. People hunted deer. They fired warning shots at wild dogs. No one thought much of it. But the police did. There were no fingerprints. No tire tracks. No signs of forced entry. The killer had left nothing behind, at least not on the surface. But they had left questions. And fear. When detectives began digging into Sarah's life, her past pointed them in one clear direction. Dana and Lawrence told them everything, the fear, the panic, the trauma. How Sarah had believed Jason would kill her if she pushed too hard. Jason, who lived just minutes away. Jason, who owed her thousands. He was brought in for questioning. Calm, composed. He denied everything. Said he was having breakfast with the children at a local diner. Security footage and waitstaff confirmed it. The timeline held up. He was let go. Still, suspicion never left him. Sarah's friends, her family, her church community, all said the same thing. She was afraid of him. He had motive. He had means. And the murder happened steps from his old life, where he still loomed like a shadow over hers. The state announced a $5,000 reward. A local added another $500. The sheriff's department, the state police, they all asked the same thing, please. Come forward. Tell us who did this. But the silence was louder than the shotgun blast. Years passed. The seasons changed, her children grew, and still, Sarah's killer remained unknown. Then, in December 2021, the case cracked, just slightly. Police took another hard look at Jason. They dug deeper into his digital footprint. On his computer, they found something disturbing. A manuscript. A book he'd been writing. It wasn't just fiction. It was venom disguised as prose. Jason had detailed his bitterness. The chapters dripped with resentment, anger over the court-ordered payments, fantasies about getting out of them, even dark musings on how to escape his responsibilities entirely. It was all there, in black and white. The investigators believed that Jason hadn't pulled the trigger, but someone had. Someone he may have hired. A ghost for hire. A contract written not in ink, but in blood. The horror of Sarah's final moments still lingers in the cracks of that quiet neighborhood, in the whispers of churchgoers who remember her laugh, in the fear etched into her children's hearts. The wind there feels colder now, like it's still carrying her last breath, lost in the silence, begging to be heard. The writings Jason left behind were filled with venom. Page after page, his words painted a cruel, dark image of Sarah and, disturbingly, of women in general. What started off as bitter rants quickly caught the attention of detectives who were already circling in closer after Sarah's murder. These weren't the scribbles of a grieving man, they were glimpses into a deeply disturbed mind. The kind that hides behind a calm face, but inside, brews a storm of resentment and control. But it wasn't just the hatred in ink that raised red flags. When detectives pulled Jason's financial records, the trail got more twisted. Between September 7th and November 15th, the weeks leading to Sarah's brutal death, he moved exactly $2,600 in 7 separate payments to someone named Lily. On the surface, nothing screamed murder. But when the team dug deeper, they found Lily was connected to Darren, Jason's own brother. And it wasn't just some distant acquaintance. Lily and Darren had a history, long enough and close enough to suggest that her involvement was no coincidence. Lily, under questioning, admitted that the money was passed through her. Jason told her it was to help Darren repair a damaged motorcycle. A 2016 model, expensive and not something a man drowning in financial stress could easily give away. Especially since Jason claimed he'd crashed his own bike but never filed a report. Instead, he simply handed the damaged machine over to Darren, telling him to fix it, no police, no paperwork, just a quiet handoff and $2,600 sent in parts. But this explanation, shaky and thin, didn't sit right with investigators. Why hide the payments? Why involve Lily at all? Slowly, a darker theory took root. That Jason hadn't just been venting with his pen or giving away old motorcycles out of brotherly love. That maybe, just maybe, the money wasn't for repairs at all. That it was payment. Payment for something far more sinister. Darren wasn't just any brother. He was trouble wrapped in leather and gasoline. Born and raised in the darker corners of Texas, he had the kind of past that stains every part of the present. A 2013 arrest for speeding had ended with police finding illegal drugs in his car. He served time, not much, but enough to mark him. Enough to make him a man with debts to pay and favors to return. What chilled the room during the investigation wasn't just Darren's record, it was the timeline. Darren had traveled to Alabama right before Thanksgiving in 2017, arriving just days before Sarah's murder. He stayed nearby, just long enough to become a shadow. He turned off his phone around midnight, just hours before the fatal attack, and turned it back on the next morning, already back in Texas. A clean exit. A digital vanishing act. A neighbor told police she'd seen a motorcycle that looked an awful lot like Jason's prowling near Sarah's house in the weeks before she died. And not just once. Again and again, like a ghost circling a future grave. On the night of the murder, that same bike was spotted speeding away into the dark. When police pieced it all together, a narrative as cold as it was deliberate began to emerge. Jason hadn't just harbored hatred for Sarah, he had plotted. He had paid. He had pulled the strings from a distance and let Darren carry the weight of the act. By December 2021, Jason sat behind a cold metal table, face flat, words carefully chosen. He asked for a lawyer and denied everything. Not a flicker of guilt crossed his face. But when he finally broke, when he confessed, his words weren't of sorrow. He said it like a man giving up a secret he'd kept too long. "I'm guilty," he said. Again and again. But even then, he was let out on bail, ankle monitor strapped tight, and a trial date set for June 27, 2022. Darren, meanwhile, vanished. A manhunt began. His face was everywhere, on TV screens, newspapers, gas station posters. At first, the reward was $10,000. Then $22,500. On February 5, 2022, he walked into a police station in Texas and gave himself up. No fight. No tears. No apology. He chose prison over house arrest, never saying why. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was fear. Or maybe some things don't need explaining when the guilt is heavier than the bars. Jason and Darren still spoke, their phone calls crackling with silence and shallow pleasantries. Nothing that could be used in court. Nothing that gave away the truth. But always something lurking underneath. The prosecution dragged its feet. No murder weapon. No blood trail. No witness with wide eyes and trembling hands. Just a web of circumstantial clues, money trails, motorcycle sightings, hateful writings, and a timeline lined up like dominoes. Lily swore she knew nothing. That she was used like a pawn in a game she didn't know she was playing. Eventually, the court believed her. No charges were filed against her. Jason's lawyer painted a different picture, a broken man, overwhelmed, lashing out with words but incapable of killing. The writings, they said, were therapy, not threats. His bank transfers. Acts of generosity. His presence in Alabama. Coincidence. But coincidences only stretch so far before they start to strangle the truth. 10 long days Darren spent in Alabama. Not one call between the brothers. Investigators suspected burner phones, cheap, untraceable, perfect for whispers between monsters. Not even footprints had been left at Sarah's home. No fingerprints. No tire tracks. The house was clean like someone had walked through it with gloves and silence. A video emerged of Jason eating breakfast with his children at a diner, 10 kilometers away at the time of Sarah's death. A calculated alibi, perhaps. The trial opened on September 11, 2023. A courtroom full of heavy eyes and hushed breaths. The prosecution aimed to reveal the truth beneath the silence, that Jason would rather see Sarah dead than hand over half his paycheck. But truth in court is rarely black and white. It's built on fragments. On shadows. On gut feelings and long stares. Jason and Darren sat side by side, two brothers bound not just by blood, but by the weight of a shared secret. And as the court debated evidence and motive, Sarah's absence filled the room louder than any testimony ever could. It started with Jason. Quiet, cooperative Jason. From the very beginning, he opened his life to the police, his phone, his computer, everything laid bare like an offering. His lawyers stood tall in court, insisting that no real criminal would be so forthcoming, especially if they knew what damning evidence lurked inside those devices. But the courtroom didn't buy it. Not the jury, not the judge. Jason's behavior, that eerie calm, the slow, dry confession after the arrest, it all seemed too rehearsed, too clean. After 6 long days of trial, the jury returned after just 6 hours, cold and decisive. Jason Starr and his brother Darren Starr were found guilty, murder and conspiracy to murder. Life in prison, no parole, and a fine that meant nothing to men who'd never walk free again. Darren's lawyer made noise about an appeal. Jason's lawyer said nothing. What could he say? Jason had already spilled the truth in a chilling, emotionless admission. Their children, caught in the crossfire of blood and betrayal, were sent to live with Sarah's grieving parents. In court, one of the older twins, voice trembling with hurt, whispered that they never wanted to see their father again. And yet, this wasn't the first time a family had collapsed under its own secrets. Fort Worth, Texas. The kind of place where the days are hot and the secrets are hotter. Marie Robarts had grown up there, her life stitched into the fabric of military moves and broken promises. Her father, Stephen, came from a modest life. His father owned an insurance agency, and Stephen himself was a known figure around school. He married Beth when she turned 18, a high school love story sealed with a July wedding and, soon after, a baby girl named Marie. Stephen had signed up for 4 years in the Navy, and the family was always moving, always packing up, like ghosts trailing the coastline. It wore Beth down. She'd imagined love, she got duty. She described their marriage as a relic of youth, a mistake wrapped in obligation. And Stephen? He didn't take criticism well. His temper boiled just under the surface. By 1979, Beth had enough. She filed for divorce. Marie tried to hold it together. She was the kind of girl teachers remembered, quiet, polite, sharp. She played clarinet, took art and dance classes, and made every effort to bloom in soil that kept changing. After the divorce, she and her mother moved to a nearby city while Stephen stayed back in Fort Worth, tucked into a one-bedroom apartment like a man shrinking away from his own life. Marie saw him twice a month, no more. Then Frank entered the picture. Beth met Frank Rouse, a fellow Navy man, during her husband's service. At first, it was small talk, forgettable. But after the divorce, that talk turned into something more, something dangerous. They moved in together. Frank was now a police officer in a small Texas town, population just under 10,000. He had a son, the same age as Marie. The idea of one big blended family fell apart almost immediately. Beth worked nights in the ER, and Frank barely tried to bond with the kids. Their marriage cracked early, but the worst came when Marie was 16. She walked into her home and caught Frank in bed with another woman. The image seared itself into her like a brand. She told her mother, shaking, raging. But Beth, stoic, cold, did nothing. She didn't yell. Didn't cry. Didn't leave. She said nothing at all. That silence killed something in Marie. From that moment, she knew she was alone. Beth tried to be everything, a nurse, a wife, a mother, but time pulled her in too many directions. Frank wasn't blamed. Not by her. She believed that if she just worked harder, gave more, the cracks would disappear. But Marie was done pretending. She told her mother Frank wasn't good enough, begged her to leave him. Beth refused. Told her daughter to stay out of adult matters. The house turned cold. Arguments turned frequent. Marie began to slip away, emotionally at first, then physically. She gave her mother an ultimatum, leave him or lose her. Beth refused to choose. So Marie began to pack. Beth didn't stop her. Instead, she called some relatives back in Fort Worth and arranged for Marie to stay with them. Marie moved in and tried to start over, new school, new surroundings, but after 5 days, the money ran out, and so did her strength. She wanted to come home. She called her mother. Beth tried, this time. She begged Frank to reconsider, to allow Marie back into their home. But Frank said no. His son had tried the same thing, left to stay with his biological mother, then wanted to come back. Frank didn't allow it. Once you leave, you don't return. That was the rule. A rule carved in stone. Beth was stuck. Frank had drawn the line, and she didn't step over it. The tension in the house grew thick, bitter. People around them thought Frank was right, that parents shouldn't let kids play games with their loyalty. But this wasn't about discipline. It was about control. About power. Marie was out, and she knew it. The betrayal twisted something inside her. She didn't just dislike Frank anymore. She hated him. Hated his rules, his past, his presence. She moved into a small rented apartment, alone. Her mother stayed behind with the man who had torn their family apart. And something about that felt unnatural. Beth started to lose sleep. She'd find Frank staring out the window for long stretches, muttering about discipline and loyalty. He stopped speaking to her for days at a time. Marie, in her small apartment, kept a knife by the bed. Just in case. Just in case he came. Because she'd seen something in his eyes once. Something not right. Something that told her he wasn't done ruining lives yet. And neither was she. That's how it starts. Not with a scream. Not with a gunshot. But with a choice. One mother. One daughter. One man too obsessed with control. And the silence between them growing darker by the day. It had been weeks since Marie last saw her mother. She used to count the days, then the hours, then she just stopped counting altogether. She hoped, prayed even, that Beth would come back for her. But Frank, cold, unmoved Frank, made sure that never happened. No matter how Marie begged, no matter how long she waited, the door to her old life stayed shut. And Beth, her own mother, let it. Beth didn't understand the weight of silence in a child's life. She didn't hear the cries that didn't come out loud, or feel the ache behind Marie's stiff smiles. Feeling smothered by guilt and helplessness, Beth sought therapy. She thought maybe a psychologist could unravel the knots her life had become. But Marie had already made a decision. She packed up her grief, her notebooks, her shaking hands, and returned to her father, Stephen. Stephen wasn't prepared for the ghost that stepped through his door. He remembered Marie as a bright, curious girl. Now, she barely spoke. Her presence was quiet, eerie even, like a fog that lingered in rooms long after she left them. But Stephen welcomed her back with open arms. He was alone, wrestling his own demons in a dim, lonely apartment. His battles with depression had taken shape in the piles of laundry, the unpaid bills, the sticky dishes in the sink. But having Marie back gave him a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, hope. He tried. God, he tried. He took her out to the movies, took walks with her through the park where dry leaves whispered things the living never would. But Marie didn't laugh. Not really. Sandra Hudgens, Stephen's girlfriend, who lived just across the hall, could see it too. She noticed how Marie flinched when touched, how she stared out the window for hours, eyes vacant, like she was listening for someone who never called back. Marie hated everything about her new life: the mattress she slept on in the cramped kitchen, the food Stephen cooked, the smell of bleach that lingered after his half-hearted cleaning attempts. She cried on the phone to Beth, begged to come home. She didn't care about Frank anymore. She just wanted her mother back. But Beth said Frank wouldn't allow it. Her voice always trembled when she said that. That's when Marie started writing in her diary. Not the kind of diary with hearts and secrets, but raw pages soaked in dark thoughts. She wrote about what it would be like to disappear. About ending things. About what people would say at her funeral. When Stephen found those pages, his face turned pale. He showed Beth immediately. They didn't know she was watching them from the hall, emotionless. The diary had done what it needed to do. But oddly enough, things started getting better, or so it seemed. Marie's grades climbed. She made a few friends. She joined a school art group and started painting again. The teachers whispered that Marie was turning a corner. Sandra began to trust her. Stephen smiled more often. Life, on the surface, looked normal. But deep down, Marie was just waiting. 3 years passed like a shadow crawling slowly over a wall. On February 18th, something shifted. Stephen had brought home Mexican takeout for dinner. They shared a meal in silence. Later that evening, he told Marie he was heading to church. It was a regular evening, no argument, no tension. An hour later, Stephen came back doubled over in pain. His skin was clammy. He was trembling. His eyes darted around the room like he didn't recognize it anymore. His breath came in shallow bursts. Sandra ran in as Marie stood still, watching. Then came the foam at his mouth. The wheezing. The convulsions. The ambulance was called, and within minutes, they arrived. Paramedics fought to keep him alive, but his throat had closed. By the time they loaded him onto the stretcher, it was too late. Stephen died on the way to the hospital. Marie didn't cry. She sat next to Sandra with a blank stare. Her hands were perfectly still. Not even a tremor. Beth and Frank were told hours later. When Beth saw her daughter again, she was overcome. She promised that things would change, that she was leaving Frank. She said they'd move to Panama City, just the two of them. That she'd never let Marie feel unwanted again. But when they did move, something stayed behind. Marie had frequent panic attacks. Her breathing would turn shallow, her eyes wide, her fingers clawing at invisible forces. Beth believed it was grief. She couldn't have known what really haunted Marie. She got her daughter therapy, and the psychologist diagnosed her with major depression. Beth was terrified that Stephen's mental illness had passed into Marie like some dark legacy. Then came Frank again. He showed up in Panama City, remorseful. He begged Beth to take him back. Promised to be a better husband, to change. Beth, weak and wounded, forgave him. Marie was stunned. She had hoped for a future free of Frank. But again, Beth chose him. So Marie made another move. This time to Mansfield, to live with her grandfather Jim. She flourished there, polite, well-mannered, focused. Teachers praised her. Neighbors adored her. She had charm, but never arrogance. She was soft-spoken, never late, never rebellious. She made friends easily, especially with Stacy, a bubbly, popular girl from school. Stacy liked Marie immediately, though she sensed something off. A heaviness behind Marie's calm smile. A kind of quiet pain that never showed itself, but never really left the room either. One night in January 1994, the two girls stayed up late, curled in blankets, reciting lines from Hamlet for school. Stacy read the lines about poison slipping into ears during sleep. Marie went still. Her breath hitched slightly. Her eyes, wide and empty, locked on Stacy for just a second too long. And then she smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Stacy didn't know it yet, but that was the moment everything changed. She looked pale, drained, really. Her skin, almost translucent in the dim living room light, seemed to pull tight around her bones. Stacy noticed it right away. There was something off about Marie, something deeper than a cold or a bad day. Concerned, she asked softly, "Are you okay?" At first, Stacy assumed the worst in a teenage kind of way, maybe Marie was scared she was pregnant. But Marie shook her head. "No, it's not that," she whispered. So Stacy tried to joke, trying to shake off the heavy air surrounding them. "You didn't crash your grandfather's car or something, right?" Again, Marie shook her head. Then, almost nervously, Stacy laughed. "You didn't kill anyone, did you?" Marie went dead silent. The silence was so thick it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. Then Marie looked at Stacy, not in fear, but with eyes hollowed by something ancient, something irreversible, and asked a question that turned Stacy's stomach. "What would you do if someone you loved did something terrible? Like in real life, not a movie?" Stacy stared, unsure how to respond. And that's when Marie broke. She tried to stand from the couch but collapsed back down, her knees buckling under the weight of whatever she'd been carrying. Tears welled in her eyes before they fell fast, hot, and out of control. Her voice cracked through the sobs. "I poisoned him," she whispered. "I poisoned my father." The room tilted. The air grew cold. Something in the atmosphere changed, as if the house itself recoiled in horror. And then came the story. A twisted, haunted recollection from the shadows of Marie's memory. It began in early February 1993, in a high school chemistry class. She had been paying close attention that day, not because she loved science, but because of what was sitting unattended, a small bottle of an obscure, nearly undetectable chemical. She poured some into a napkin. Folded it carefully. Slipped it into her backpack. That night, as her father prepared his meal, Marie added a pinch of the substance. Just a little. Not to kill. Just to make him sick. Just enough, she said, so her mother would come back. So someone would take care of her again. But the next morning, he didn't wake up. Marie was shattered by what she had done, but she couldn't tell anyone. So she kept it buried deep inside, where it began to rot her from within. Until now. "Please," she begged Stacy, voice shaking. "Please don't tell anyone. I've never told anyone else. Not even my mom. You're the only one." She said the poison was nearly impossible to detect. That it induced a heart attack that looked natural. She swore she hadn't known it would kill him. She just wanted him ill. Just sick enough. Just enough for love to come back. Stacy listened, frozen in place. But she couldn't sleep after that. Her dreams turned to screams. For weeks, she watched Marie walk the halls of their school, smiling, laughing. But now, it all felt like a lie wrapped in a teenage girl's skin. Eventually, she told her mother. And her mother, pale with dread, called the poison control center, but the technician on the other end grew suspicious and refused to say more. They hung up, stunned and frightened. Stacy suggested therapy, or a priest. Anything to get Marie to talk to someone who could help. But nothing got better. A year passed. On the anniversary of Stephen Robarts' death, Jim, Marie's grandfather, took both girls out to dinner in his memory. As he raised a glass in tribute, Marie and Stacy both broke down. They couldn't hold it in anymore. The weight was too much. Stacy could no longer carry Marie's secret. It was eating her alive. She went to the school counselor, who, thankfully, took it seriously. The police were contacted. But the lab lacked proper equipment to test for the compound Marie had mentioned. The case stalled. Stacy began distancing herself, afraid of what more she might learn. Marie thought the storm had passed. But in October 1994, the police came calling. A Fort Worth officer contacted Stacy. The toxicology report had finally come in. And what they found wasn't just tragic, it was chilling. Stephen Robarts had been poisoned. The dose? Over 250 times the lethal amount. Marie had not just wanted her father ill. She had planned it. Measured it. Executed it. She was arrested at the University of Texas at Austin, where she had started fresh. People who knew her there described her as sweet. Innocent. Almost angelic. No one saw the haunted girl beneath the surface. When questioned, she confessed instantly. She insisted she never meant to kill him. That it was a mistake. That she just wanted to be with her mother again. But prosecutors weren't buying it. They believed money played a role. After all, Marie had received $60,000 from her father's life insurance. Her mother used that money to hire 2 top attorneys from Fort Worth. The courtroom became a battlefield. Stacy testified for the prosecution. She told them everything: Marie's confession, her mental state, her chilling calm. The defense called a psychiatrist who painted Marie not as a killer but as a girl drowning in guilt and trauma. A child abandoned by her mother, desperate for love, blinded by pain. He said she suffered from post-traumatic stress. Marie sat quietly through most of the trial, often crying behind her hands, her eyes bloodshot and sunken. She told the court she loved her father. That she never meant to hurt him. The prosecution tore that image apart. They pointed to the precision of the poisoning. The outrageous dose. The fact that Marie had discussed other options, burning down his apartment, for example, to get her mother's attention. People thought she was joking. But now it all sounded like a blueprint. Her mother, Beth, wept in court, blaming herself. If she'd just taken Marie with her when she left, she said, this never would have happened. Marie's grandfather, Jim, begged the judge for mercy. He saw a child lost, not a cold-blooded killer. But the jury saw something else. A girl with an innocent face and a hollow soul. A daughter who became a silent executioner in her own home. A child capable of feeding death to her father, bite by bite, across a dinner table. And that kind of truth, the kind that grows roots in the dark, is hard to forget. Hard to forgive. And impossible to bury. The house had always looked peaceful from the outside, a quiet street, the neatly trimmed lawn, soft yellow porch light flickering at dusk. But on that night, the stillness concealed something unspeakable. When the church minister arrived to check on Matthew and Mary, he wasn't expecting silence from such a warm, inviting home. The television was blaring inside, lights flooded the windows, yet no one answered his persistent knocks. He called out again and again, his voice echoing through the eerie calm, but only silence greeted him. Worried, he turned to the neighbors and together they searched the property. Eventually, someone remembered an old key stashed away in a rusted tin box inside the shed. At around 9 p.m., with hesitant hands and breath held tight, they opened the door. What they saw would be carved into their memories forever. Matthew was sprawled on the bedroom floor, his body unnaturally twisted, bathed in a dark, thick pool of blood. His eyes were open, frozen in a final expression of disbelief. The air was heavy with something more than death. It was confusion, betrayal, maybe even guilt. The pastors backed out, trembling, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. Sirens followed, breaking the night's quiet with their shrill urgency. But it was too late. The doctors confirmed what everyone already feared: Matthew was gone. The police swept in, but the crime scene was already compromised. Dozens of well-meaning footsteps muddied the evidence. Even so, something stood out immediately: Mary and the children were missing. The family's car was gone too. What had first seemed like a horrific tragedy now looked like an abduction. The urgency shifted. Maybe they'd been taken. Maybe they were in danger. But the truth was something colder, far darker. An autopsy confirmed the worst, a fatal shotgun blast to Matthew's chest. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't clumsy. It was lethal and direct. As investigators dove deeper, a different Mary emerged, a woman not just running from grief, but from the law. Financial records uncovered layers of fraud. Fake checks. Forged documents. Over $17,000 stolen in carefully plotted scams. A woman once seen as a quiet wife and loving mother was now tangled in lies, deception, and perhaps murder. She was found 600 kilometers away in Orange Beach, Alabama. A patrol officer noticed her minivan make a sharp, illegal turn into a grocery store parking lot. It seemed harmless at first, until backup arrived and they approached the vehicle. Mary was behind the wheel. Her face was drained, her expression empty. In the back seat, her daughter sat wide-eyed, silent. Beneath a blanket was the 12-gauge shotgun, the same type used to end Matthew's life. Mary didn't resist arrest. She offered no tears, no explanations. Only a quiet whisper of names, relatives to contact so the girls could be taken care of. The questions, though, poured in like a flood. Why did she run? Why was the weapon in her car? Why did she stay silent as her children clung to her? Her confession came slowly, fragmented, like pieces of a nightmare she was still waking up from. She and Matthew had argued that night, something minor, she claimed. They slept in separate rooms. Later, she remembered reaching for the shotgun he kept for protection. Then, nothing. She said it felt like amnesia. A noise. A flash. Blood. Her husband gasping on the bed, falling to the floor. She couldn't remember pulling the trigger. She couldn't remember why. 5 months later, her father, pale and shaken, mortgaged their home to pay her $750,000 bail. She walked free, but not far. She waited in Tennessee, working in a dry cleaner, her trial looming like a storm cloud ready to burst. In court, the prosecutors painted her as a calculated killer. They said she planned every step, disabling Matthew's phone, choosing the moment, loading the weapon quietly. She knew where the guns were, and more importantly, she knew what he'd find if he ever checked her bank statements. The web of lies was starting to tear. Maybe she panicked. Maybe she wanted to escape the exposure. But her defense painted a different picture. Mary, they said, was not a monster. She was a victim. She lived in fear. Matthew, the holy man admired by the community, had a different face at home, violent, abusive, manipulative. He raped her, forced her into scams, used their children as leverage. Her defense argued that the murder weapon must have already been loaded, because loading that old shotgun made noise, a lot of it. If Matthew had heard it, he would have reacted. But he didn't. Which meant it had been ready. Still, the evidence wasn't enough to convince the jury of innocence. Yet, the family's emotional pleas, Mary's vacant sorrow, and years of hidden suffering seemed to sway the court. The prosecution demanded a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 35 years. But the judge, perhaps sensing something irreparably broken in Mary's soul, sentenced her to 28 years, with parole eligibility in just 7. Years passed. Appeals were filed, denied. And in 2003, Mary walked out of prison after serving just 8 years. She changed her name. Married again. Disappeared into a different kind of life. But for those who remember the case, there are no clean conclusions. Was she a monster in disguise or a woman suffocating under secrets and fear? Did she act out of desperation, confusion, or something darker? No one knows exactly what happened behind that bedroom door. The only truth that remains is a body on the floor, blood soaked into the carpet, and a quiet house that still refuses to tell its full story. The neighbors never really saw anything unusual. Just a quiet house with trimmed hedges, a swing in the front yard, and a woman who always smiled a little too politely. Mary Freeman's life looked ordinary. But inside that home, something festered, something dark, decaying over years of fear, secrets, and quiet suffering. The morning it all happened, the air was still. Cold sunlight pushed through the blinds, and in the silence before dawn, a baby's cries broke the calm. Mary was already wide awake, not from the noise, but from the weight in her chest. She hadn't truly slept in years. Matthew, her husband, had grown more restless, more cruel, over time. That morning, when their youngest daughter wailed from her crib, Matthew's anger boiled over. He stormed into the nursery, his footsteps loud enough to make the walls flinch. Without a word, he ripped the child from the blankets and covered her mouth, muffling her little sobs. Mary's heart dropped. She begged, her voice cracking, "Give her to me, please." His eyes, full of contempt, stared through her. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't. But then, with a grunt, he shoved the baby into her arms and walked back to bed. No apologies. No explanation. Just silence, again. That silence was always the worst part. She stood there for a while, clutching her daughter like a shield, listening to the stillness. Her hands trembled. Her chest ached. And then something inside her snapped, not with rage, but with something far more terrifying, the absence of fear. A numb clarity settled over her. She walked to the hallway closet. Her fingers found the shotgun Matthew kept locked away. Her hands knew the motions, he'd made sure she knew them. She loaded the shell. Step by step, she made her way back to the bedroom. He was sleeping. For a few seconds, she just stood there, staring at the man she once trusted. The same man who'd broken her in every way. He forced her to dress like someone she wasn't. He made her wear a wig, strip her heels, and walk around their home like she was on display. The same shoes were still in the closet. She'd worn them to court because they asked her to prove her story. When she saw them again, she collapsed in tears. He had humiliated her. Hurt her. Controlled her. They never knew how often she bled without bruises, how many nights she cried into her pillow as he slept beside her, his hand still clenched in a fist. Or how many times she looked at her children and feared they'd become him. Or worse, his next victims. The gun went off. The sound was deafening, yet strangely distant. Mary didn't even feel the kickback. Matthew's body jerked, then slid off the bed, hitting the floor with a hollow thud. For a second, she thought he was still breathing. She backed away, waiting for him to rise in fury, to scream. But there was nothing. Only silence. She fled with the children. No shoes. No coat. Just panic and the echo of a gunshot still ringing in her ears. It wasn't until she reached the neighbor's porch that the tears came. She didn't remember what she said when they opened the door, just that she kept whispering, "I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to." When the police questioned her, the story changed. At first, she claimed it was an accident. Later, she confessed it was rage. In court, the prosecution painted her as cold, calculating. They said she'd killed Matthew to hide her financial deceptions, money withdrawn, forged checks, credit cards. They said she wanted freedom. That she chose murder. But Mary's lawyers told a different story. They told the jury about the years of abuse, the control, the terror. They told them how Matthew had become a monster behind closed doors. How Mary had once tried to leave but was dragged back, literally. How he'd broken her down until she could no longer tell the difference between obedience and survival. To prove her truth, Mary pulled out the old wig and those heels. In that courtroom, she wore them again. Her shoulders shook as she sat in the witness stand, looking like a broken doll forced into costume. Even the jury members looked away. After 8 long hours, they returned with a verdict, guilty, not of murder, but of manslaughter. The judge shocked everyone. Mary Freeman was sentenced to just 210 days in prison, most of which she'd already served. Then, she was sent to a mental institution for 60 days. After that, she was free. Free, in the eyes of the law. But freedom isn't always clean. She lost everything. Her reputation. Her peace. Her anonymity. She tried working again, first at a dry cleaner, then at a daycare in McMinnville. But whispers followed her everywhere. Parents pulled their children away. Clients asked if she was that woman from the trial. People stared at her like she had a scar across her soul. The media didn't help. Some called her a murderer. Others, a martyr. But Mary just wanted to disappear. In August of 2008, she got custody of her daughters. Matthew's parents fought hard to stop it. They said she was unstable, dangerous. The courtroom heard the same arguments all over again. But the court ruled in her favor. And then, she vanished. Today, no one knows where Mary Freeman lives. She's in her 50s now. Some say she moved out of state, others whisper that she changed her name. But the house still stands on that quiet street, the swing still creaks in the wind, and sometimes, just sometimes, neighbors say they hear crying at dawn, faint and childlike, from inside the walls. The house on Elm Street had always looked ordinary from the outside. White picket fence, two-car garage, trimmed lawn. It was the kind of place people drove past without a second glance. But behind those walls, something twisted had been growing, something no one could see. Neighbors often described the family as reserved but pleasant. Kathy was a gentle woman, soft-spoken, with a warm smile that lingered even in the coldest months. James, her husband, carried himself with confidence, perhaps a little too much for someone who rarely spoke about his work. No one had ever heard them argue, no loud voices, no slamming doors. They kept their troubles sealed away, like secrets buried in the foundation of their home. But when the police arrived that morning, drawn by a chilling 911 call, they stepped into a quiet horror. Kathy was found lifeless in her bed, the brutal force of an axe embedded in her skull. There were no signs of forced entry, no stolen items. Just silence. The kind that lingers after something terrible has happened. Their 3-year-old daughter had wandered the halls alone for hours with her mother's blood still staining the sheets. As investigators dug into the family's life, they began to see cracks in the illusion. A marriage counseling brochure, crumpled and forgotten in the car's glove box, hinted at tensions neither friend nor family had ever seen. James, the grieving husband, seemed cooperative at first, answering questions, offering samples of his hair and blood. But then, just a day after his wife's death, he vanished. He didn't say goodbye. Didn't call. He just disappeared. They found him later in Michigan, hiding in plain sight at his parents' house. He explained away his sudden trip as needing space, but suspicion was already growing like mold. His resume, it turned out, was a carefully crafted lie. He had faked a doctorate, earning a position he never should have held. The pressure from work, the failing marriage, the lies, it all began to weigh on the picture of a man trying to hold up a collapsing world. But there wasn't enough. Not then. Forensic science was still primitive in 1982. DNA testing was a fantasy, and the bloodied axe offered nothing concrete. Without motive, without proof, the case went cold. James walked free. Years passed. James remarried. He met Sharon at a trade show, and something about her warmth drew him in. She didn't press for details when he briefly mentioned Kathy, just said it was a tragedy, and moved on. Their love blossomed over shared silence. They married and moved across the country, leaving the past behind like dust on old photo frames. But the police never stopped watching. By 2015, new eyes had taken on the old case. Brighton's police, with help from the FBI, began to reopen every box, every folder, every haunting piece of evidence. They zeroed in again on James. On April 16, 2016, they came to his door, not with handcuffs, but with questions. James smiled. Invited them in. He sat calmly, sipping coffee at his kitchen table, and agreed to a recorded conversation. He was polite. Steady. Maybe too steady. When they asked if he had anything to do with Kathy's murder, his response was fast, angry. I loved my wife. I would never hurt her. Sharon was right beside him. Firm. Loyal. She insisted that James was kind, loving. She'd seen no aggression. No darkness. Not once. But love can blind. And silence can lie. When the interview ended, the officers walked away empty-handed. Again. In a final desperate attempt, they sent the murder weapon to the FBI lab. Time had not been kind to it, the axe had been cleaned, tampered with, the blood nearly erased. No DNA. No fingerprints. Just rust and silence. Then came Dr. Michael Benn, a renowned forensic pathologist. He combed through every detail, photos, records, stomach contents, temperatures, and made a chilling conclusion. Kathy had died around 3:30 a.m., a full 3 hours before James claimed he left for work. She'd eaten shortly before her death, her body still digesting breakfast as her killer swung the blade. James must have seen her. Must have known. Police were no longer convinced by the theory of a robbery gone wrong. Nothing had been taken. No valuables disturbed. Why would a burglar kill a sleeping woman who never saw them? There was no answer that made sense, except the one that had been whispered for decades. On November 8, 2019, nearly 4 decades after Kathy's final breath, James was arrested. 67 years old. Quiet. Still without a confession. But time had finally cornered him. What once was silence had become a scream echoing through the years. And in the middle of it all, a man who had built a second life on the bones of the first, watched it all unravel. Slowly. Relentlessly. Justice, though late, had finally come home. The morning air was still, a strange silence hanging over the neighborhood like an omen. They said the crime scene had been staged, something about the placement of the body, the scattered objects, the forced drawer that didn't quite match the mess surrounding it. It all looked too deliberate, too rehearsed, like someone had been trying to tell a story that wasn't theirs to tell. Law enforcement knew this. So did James. James Cronak sat still in court, his jaw tense, fingers clenched just enough to keep from trembling. The jury's eyes stayed on him longer than they should have. He wasn't just the grieving husband anymore, he was the prime suspect in the murder of his wife, Kathy Cronak, a woman who died decades earlier under circumstances no one truly understood. It wasn't supposed to come back to him. Not after all this time. Not like this. Back in 1982, there was someone else. A man who didn't belong but was always nearby, like a wolf circling a cabin in the woods. Edler Rabbi. He lived just a mile and a half away from Kathy's home. Locals whispered about him, and women avoided walking alone after dark. His name came up early in the investigation, but the police only spoke to him once. One time. Then they let him go. What they didn't know, what they should have known, was the trail of torment he left behind. Rabbi had been in and out of prison more times than anyone could count, serving over 3 decades for various crimes. His obsession with control, his dark cravings, they didn't fade behind bars. They festered. He didn't just hurt women. He hunted them. His first confirmed kill was almost a decade after Kathy's. A 27-year-old woman named Stephanie Kapczynski. Rabbi strangled her in her apartment in 1991. He confessed to the killing in 2012, decades later, in a shaky voice that trembled between guilt and pride. He claimed it wasn't meant to happen, said it got out of hand. Said she didn't scream at first, and he thought that meant she wanted it. He confessed to Kathy's murder too. Before his death in 2014, he claimed she was one of his victims. But the confession was twisted, full of errors and warped details. Her name was spelled wrong. The timing didn't add up. He described a crime scene that never existed. And yet, there were pieces. Little shards of truth hidden inside his lies, like bones buried in shallow ground. Still, the police dismissed him again. Said the weapon used, an axe, wasn't typical of his pattern. There was no sign of sexual assault. The handwriting on the strange note left behind didn't match his. Experts pointed to these inconsistencies and ruled him out. His dead face was no longer useful to the case. He couldn't be questioned, couldn't explain, couldn't threaten, couldn't run. And so, the suspicion circled back to James. James's lawyers argued the investigation had been sloppy from the beginning. That the real killer had walked away while the cops focused on tying up a convenient story with a neat bow. But by then, it was too late. The officers who had botched the case. Dead. Retired. Unreachable. Ghosts with badges. The prosecution painted James as a man who wore grief like a mask. They said the shoe print near Kathy's body matched his. They said only someone close to her would know the quiet ways in and out of that house. They said he had motive, family trouble, hidden resentment, control slipping away. But even the forensics fought back. Kathy's body had been under an electric blanket when she died. No one could say for sure whether it was on or off. No one knew the exact temperature it might have reached. Experts tried to determine the time of death based on the cooling of her body, but each result came back with wide margins of error. Some said she died after James left for work. Others insisted she was already gone when he kissed her goodbye that morning. So the courtroom became a place of ghosts and shadows, of maybes and may-have-beens. The jurors watched. They listened. But they didn't feel certainty. They felt the weight of confusion. And yet, when the final words were read out, their decision was clear. James Cronack. Guilty. Second-degree murder. Sentenced to 25 years behind bars. The gavel dropped like thunder. People gasped. Some cried. Others left the courtroom in silence, their faces pale, as though they'd just seen something crawl out of the past to wrap its fingers around the future. James didn't flinch. He just sat there, eyes blank, lips parted slightly, as though he was still waiting for someone to wake him up. Those who knew him swore it couldn't be true. They remembered him as gentle, patient. They remembered the way he used to hold Kathy's hand like it was something precious. But the law didn't care about memory. It cared about evidence, confusing, conflicting, fragile evidence. Evidence that could lie just as easily as a man could. And maybe the real killer, whoever it was, had known that all along. And somewhere far away, in the cold silence of a forgotten grave, Kathy Cronack still waited for someone to finally get it right. She had always been the kind of person who gave more than she ever took. Aisling was young, bright, and full of life, just 28, with eyes that carried warmth and dreams that reached far beyond the horizon. She had worked hard for everything she had. After years of study, she returned to the very school she once walked through as a girl, this time not as a student, but as a teacher, guiding first graders with a voice full of encouragement and hands that brought music to their lives every weekend. She was the kind of woman who made even ordinary days feel like something special. Her students adored her. The staff admired her. And her family? They beamed with pride every time her name came up. Aisling wasn't just kind, she was purposeful, driven, grounded in her values. She was the kind of soul that lit up a room without even trying. And when she spoke of her future, it was always with a tender certainty, a family of her own, a house full of laughter, a life built on love. She had been with Ryan for 6 years, a love story that began in their teens, faded briefly, and then found its way back, stronger, more mature. They often spoke of marriage, children, building a life together. Their bond felt unshakable, as though fate had stitched them together with golden thread. 2 days before they were supposed to leave for a trip, something they'd both been looking forward to, Aisling laced up her shoes for a run, completely unaware that she was walking toward the end of her story. The Grand Canal in Tullamore had always been one of her favorite places. The air was clean, the paths well-trodden, the water peaceful. She loved that stretch, the way it welcomed her like an old friend after a long day. After school, she went home, changed, told her mother where she was going. Her mother smiled, reminded her to be safe, and watched her leave. It would be the last time. About an hour later, two runners warming up on the opposite side of the canal saw something strange, something that didn't feel right. A man, hovering too close to a young woman who was jogging, then suddenly lunging at her, dragging her into the thicket that bordered the path. They ran, shouting, powerless without phones. Their feet pounded the pavement as they rushed to find help. When emergency services arrived, they were met with the chilling silence that only follows violence. Aisling was found in the bushes just off the path. Her body was still, her clothes bloodied, her face bruised and lacerated. The paramedics tried, God, they tried, for 10 whole minutes. But she was already gone. Her body had shut down from blood loss, the wounds on her neck too deep, too many. There was no saving her. The autopsy would later reveal 11 distinct injuries to the side of her neck. One wound, deep and cruel, had sliced her throat so precisely that she would have been unable to cry out. There were defensive cuts on her hands, small but desperate, the kind you get when you're trying to fight with nothing but fear and willpower. They found her keys near her body, clutched tightly, her final, instinctive attempt to protect herself. Near her, a mobile phone, a pair of sunglasses, and a green bicycle were discovered, left behind by the man who tore her future away. The bike had a vibrant frame, bright green, almost mocking in color. The kind of thing you remember. And people had seen him. Emma was walking her dog when she noticed the cyclist trailing Aisling. Too close. Too focused. She thought they might be together, but something about the man felt wrong. He didn't look like someone out for a casual ride. His skin tone, she described, was yellowish. His hair cropped short. A black tracksuit clung to his body, marked with red symbols. He looked like a man who didn't belong, not because of where he was from, but because of how he moved. Predatory. Measured. Emma wasn't alone. Jenna, another woman nearby, had also seen the incident unfold. Together, they witnessed the moment the man sprang from his bike and grabbed Aisling with terrifying force. Jenna saw her scream, heard the words that quickly dissolved into silence. And then, that silence stretched, unnatural and cold. It was the kind of silence that fills the space when something terrible has happened. Aisling's final moments were ones of fear, of struggle, of unbearable violence. The man didn't run immediately. Even when Jenna threatened to call the police, he held on. It was as if he wasn't done, like whatever darkness lived inside him hadn't yet been satisfied. The green bike became the key. It was found discarded, tossed aside like a toy. But it held fingerprints. And the GPS tracker Aisling wore gave precise data, her movements, the moment her heart stopped. The killer vanished into the world after that. But the horror of what happened didn't. It clung to the canal, to the people who witnessed it, to a family shattered by loss. Aisling's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a wound cut deep into the soul of a community that loved her. And somewhere out there, the man who silenced her still breathes. But so do the memories she left behind, memories that whisper her name every time the wind brushes past the water, every time a child sings the song she once taught. Aisling was supposed to have a future. Instead, she became a ghost, haunting the path she once ran, haunting the lives of all who now know her story.